And welcome to Delightful Dissent. It's episode 33, and we're going to be looking at the assumption, perhaps the accusation, you've changed. I think this is a really interesting one because changing your mind, changing yourself, how you are, it's a vital part of growth and a vital part of learning. But it's also sometimes framed as this moral failing, as something worthy of really being like it's a problem that you've changed. So I really want to get into this because I think it's a really fascinating one. And today I'm joined by Reuben Wachs, who's a trainee counsellor and psychology podcaster. So thanks for joining us on the show, Reuben.
Thanks so much, man. Pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you on. And if you're new to Delightful Dissent, it's an idea that came up through my work where I've been working with people who are kind of making their own way and doing something different. Reuben is one of those people, but one of the things that comes up when you're doing this work is there are often these kind of hidden barriers and challenges around the implicit assumptions and the deep assumptions that underpin a lot of what we do. And actually, the work challenges quite a lot of those. And what I want to do is really share that process of challenging these assumptions and challenging these ideas, give you some ideas, stuff that will free you up to do different things and think about things differently. But perhaps more importantly, to give you ideas about how you can go out there and challenge assumptions like this yourself. It's really about doing this kind of exploration, the not knowing and the knowing, and playing with this as much as you possibly can, because for me, it's a really important thing for everyone to be able to do. The show's called Delightful Dissent because it is about going up against ideas and maybe saying, actually, we disagree. But it's not about winning and proving the other side wrong. It's about joyfully exploring what the other possibilities are and playing with all of that, rather than being, just being an outright argument, which, would be tiring for an hour. The show is genuinely live. We might talk about challenging topics, so please be advised if that's an issue for you. We might use strong language. Equally, there could be technical issues, so please do bear with us if there's any difficulties in the background. We will carry on the conversation and go through. So that's basically everything. There's no perfect answers here. It's about asking questions of yourself and asking questions of other people. So if you do have any questions and you're watching live, please do add them and we'll raise them. If you're watching afterwards, please do get in touch with either of us, and there'll be more information at the end about how you can do that. So I first started chatting to Reuben after a previous guest introduced me to him, and I was really struck by his enthusiasm and broad knowledge, and really his ability to convey some quite complex abstract stuff, which is quite a lot of the psychology and therapy world is, in really clear and tangible ways. So I really, really wanted to get him on the show to chat about this stuff. So that's probably enough of me talking. So could I ask you to introduce yourself a little bit and the kind of work that you do and who you like to work with?
Yeah, man. Well, thank you so much for those kind words. And it's lovely to be here. Big fan of the idea and what you're doing here. I just think it's great. So thank you. So my name is Reuben Wachs. I am a trainee counsellor. Yeah, I'm on my 4th year of training at the moment, and I have worked basically helping people and really delved really far into that world as far as I can at the moment to understand it and kind of make it applicable. And that's been one of my goals. And I think that's what you were kind of briefly mentioning there, which is taking ideas and theories and making it a little bit less abstract, a bit more tangible, and definitely more useful and effective. So I grew up around a lot of this kind of work. My mum was a couples therapist for 25 years, and my dad worked and assisted on loads of personal development workshops like the Mastery and the Forum. And so I've grown up a lot around this kind of work. And so when I had done my kind of DJing for a living days and that kind of stuff, I felt like I'm ready to finally put in the work, understand it, and come through. And so I've been basically doing this kind of stuff for a year. I had a podcast, I had a YouTube channel, and now I've swapped over to a podcast called Reuben Recommends.
Cool. Lovely stuff. Thank you. Yeah. It's a really interesting story. Actually, I've got kind of family history of this kind of work as well. So yeah, it's funny how it kind of surfaced for me. It surfaced after doing something else as well. So I think there's something really interesting there.
Yeah,
yeah, it kind of outs of its own accord. Yeah, so. Before we begin, though, I'd like to I always like to ask my guests to if they've got a quote that they'd like that kind of supports their position a little bit, and yeah, it gives us a place to start exploring.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've brought a really popular quote from Carl Rogers, which I think perfectly encapsulates what we're going to be talking about today, which is the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change.
I really like that. I think it is one of the core paradoxes of the human condition, I think. And yeah, great to have Carl Rogers mentioned. So is there anything particular about that quote there? What is it that really resonated for you there?
Yeah, absolutely, man. So I started thinking about this idea, this you've changed idea. It all started for me because of actually an assumption, a kind of a slogan that gets passed around a lot in the helping world, which is you can't change people. You know, you hear that, you know, you try, but you can't change people. And I started to think, I don't know how much that sits well with me, because I see change affected all the time through amazing different means, through different therapies, whether it's physical, whether it's talking, all these different, like so many different ways. And the more I thought about it, I really liked adding up both the more Eastern idea of acceptance, exactly how you are, and I think we'll definitely go into that. And I like looking at it through the deterministic argument, determinism, so free will, like we don't have free will, that kind of thing. So we have to accept who we are now because we couldn't have been any other way. And then once you've got that acceptance, and one of the key ways is through compassion, then once you've reached that point, then we shift over into the more Western view of personal growth and trying to progress forward in your life. And so that quote, I mean, can you really get better? Just framing those exact things in one sentence. So that's why that quote really spoke to me.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, I think one of the themes on this show over and over is actually this quality of accepting everything that's brought us to this point, and that it's not then therefore contradictory to want something different.
Yeah.
I think there's that in itself is, you know, it's a really, really interesting. It isn't a paradox, but it kind of feels like one, you know, that it's like, okay, this has happened and that's okay, and I now want something different.
So fun. So fun.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so the assumption we're looking at, or the idea we're looking at, is this thing of you've changed. I think it would be helpful to first of all get into a little bit of what that means, how it's used, because when I hear you've changed, and I've heard it in the past in quite accusatory tones, really. You know, this idea of change is not unproblematic. It's not something, you know, people are often, change is often a source of fear, and your change then changes situations that impact other people around you. And so it's a really interesting space. But how does this you've changed statement land for you?
Yeah, I think it is one of those unfortunate misunderstandings and misconceptions that we even have the option to not change. It's like we're going along and we're forever changing. Like if you look back, there's this funny thing that happens that is talked about with humans, where we can look back 5 years and go, wow, it's unbelievable how much I've changed. And then you go 10 years, it's insane, I'm so different. But we look forward 5 years and we expect ourselves to be exactly the same. And so we're like setting ourselves up for failure by expecting others and ourselves not to change. And so that's what I'm hoping, is that we can gently shift the perspective to create some more ease for people going forward. And when my own experience with this, you've changed, I definitely have experienced that as well, with a ex-partner for sure, because man, when you do a counseling training, there's a reason they call it the divorce course, because you change so much and you really do run the risk of changing and starting to not necessarily need, you may end up not getting those particular needs met by that partner that you would kind of, now we do know, it's kind of unconsciously we were using them for to get those needs met, affirmation, feeling like we belong, whatever it is. And so I definitely had a good amount of that you've changed because I was changing. But it's that accusation which comes out of, like you said, fear of losing what we know, what we were getting. It is that fear that brings out that accusation, I think.
Yeah, there's something, there is a really interesting relationship between change and loss and grief. You know, that's actually one of the really big things around this. For me, it's that, you know, there's that I love that comment about, you know, that we're kind of projecting forward and assuming we're going to stay the same, and absolutely. And I think how we plan on a personal and on a practical professional level, and yet leave space for emergence and change is an open question, and there are some practices that are better at it than others. But that complete ability to predict and say, okay, I'm going to feel this way, is we kind of, it's one of those things that we assume we can do, at least to some extent, and the experimental evidence is that we're utterly appalling at it.
Okay.
So it's a really interesting one, and we kind of know that on some level as well, but yet we still have to do it. But yeah, that kind of future narrative, you know, the story continuing in a certain direction, feels a very big part of this. And this is, it's interesting. We are constantly changing with dynamic systems, and everyone kind of knows that on some level. You know, we kind of know that we're experiencing things different and that we change physically. But yet you have these, one of my favorite ways of spotting a newspaper article that's not going to be worth reading about psychology is if it says something changes the brain.
Okay.
It's like, because every experience changes the brain. Yeah. It's like, if you're that, you know, it's like, well, unless you take a non-materialist position about consciousness, but the idea that there are some things that change the brain, and that is either a problem or a good thing or whatever. It's a very strange thing to say. So this changes the, like, what do we mean when we say that kind of change? And I think there is something, because there's small change, and then there is actual qualitative change. There's shift. So there's something interesting in that for me.
Yeah, I totally agree, man. I think you jumped onto something quite important with this change and loss idea, because when we look forward, there is a fear of that unknown, the fear of the void. What is that going to be like? Am I still going to be connected to my partner, to my friends, as things are changing? And as you know, as you said, we do kind of unconsciously know everything is changing all the time. And so as we get older and older and older, we're having to slowly feel the loss of, oh, I don't play sports anymore, or I don't like going out as much anymore, and therefore I don't see those friends as much anymore. So it's not that change is always positive. There is actually some challenges that come with change. But again, if you ask people, would you like to go back to the person that you were 5 years ago? Even if there's been tough things, we grow positively through challenges because we've overcome them. And I mean, that's a very existential thought, but that's been my experience for sure.
Yeah, I think that kind of, there feels something related to that around this direction of change, and this idea of, one of the interesting things around, and you mentioned bringing in Eastern philosophy and some of this, and my work's informed by some of this as well. So these ideas as well, I kind of aim for a synthesis of kind of Western approaches in science and wisdom traditions from anywhere really, but often Eastern ones. And this idea of kind of not doing anything, not having purpose, is a really, really interesting one to play with, particularly in challenging one. Like the act of not doing anything is really, really hard. Like meditating without purpose is really, really hard because your brain, there's just this space, and that idea of always having something to do feels related to this. It's like, well, if I'm changing, then was the thing that I was working towards, all that purpose, is that wasted? Is there a loss there? Is there this kind of, there's grief and then there's regret, I guess, for the narrative, for the direction that I didn't go or didn't finish or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting, that Eastern philosophy idea of kind of that acceptance of just who we are, I think is really important, actually. Apologies if I haven't fully grasped your point here. But yeah, I do think that when it comes to understanding progressive change, personal development, all that stuff, having the baseline of the Eastern self-acceptance is essential. And actually, the first time I actually thought about this, so again, apologies if I'm taking this in a new direction, but yeah, I think it's really a great starting point, actually, because this is actually how I got started on this process of thinking about this topic of change. So Brené Brown, in her conversation with Obama, one of the things she highlights as one of his greatest strengths is being able to hold two truths at the same time and bringing one in when it's most effective and bringing the other in when it's most effective. And so settling in to that self-acceptance side of the Eastern tradition, again, because we couldn't have been any other way, having compassion for that, that is what breeds the ground for the change. So that's when, if we're talking about Eastern philosophy, that is the side of it that I absolutely love when it comes to this topic.
And it's really interesting for me with these paradoxes and these emergent properties. It's these kind of things that we see as a polarity, and then actually they're more like a cycle. And what we're actually interested in emerges from the working between the two things. You kind of can't have one without the other. And very often I find, certainly my own experience and my own history is really pushing very hard on one side and hitting diminishing returns, like severe diminishing returns, because there wasn't space for the other side. And it's just a case of letting the thing cycle through. And sometimes that is the acceptance, the turning towards of the side that we're just not comfortable with, because many of us have learned that one side of a cycle is not okay, it's not safe. And actually being able to engage with that and let it happen, and then that's what allows the return and the emergence to happen.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, to bring it to a personal example, I think I have been so driven in my life to improve myself. And I've done a bit of soul searching on why there is such a strong drive for that. And then I think about a part of me, which is I have such strong people pleasing tendencies. And so then I look at those two things and I go, all right, I'm really trying that Western view of progressing and progressing and progressing. But have I really accepted myself as being good enough as I am? And what about picking my own needs? And really, until I do that, what is the purpose of this? Because then I'm just going to keep doing this. And then no matter what I achieve, I'm going to go, but am I okay? And are you all right? Am I still pleasing you? So yeah, I think spot on what you were saying.
It's that intersection, I think, and finding that crossover point, and that's the really difficult thing. And I think perhaps that intersection is maybe the root of why changing can be such a challenge for other people. If we intersect in our needs and we found a space where that works, where they're meeting our needs and we're meeting their needs, if one set of that shifts, that intersection can narrow and disappear entirely. And that's a hard thing, I think, and for me, one of the things is that is the requirement that we maintain that being part of the terms of an engagement is kind of a problem for me now. I stay away from stuff that feels like it's got that pull, because it doesn't. That's I thought that was commitment, and I don't think it actually is. I think it's something else.
Yeah, I think it's important stressing as well that change isn't necessarily easy. It's not an easy thing, and we have a lot of defenses that are trying our absolute best to stop us changing. And to explain what I mean there is, like, when we're growing up, when we're born, we rely on our parents or our caregivers just completely, because we can't not be close to them, otherwise we won't get our needs met. So we adapt our behaviors to fit their needs. And so in Jungian terms, they talk about, in life, what you're doing is you're taking these ideas and putting them in a big bag. You're putting them in the satchel behind you, and you're walking along through life. Oh, I must be like this. I must succeed. I must please others, or I must try hard, whatever it is. I must work hard. And then as an adult, trying to unpick those and take them out of the bag can actually be really tough. And the reason is this: when you are a child, the reason you do these adapted behaviors is to try and keep yourself basically safe, because survival is our number one priority. So when we do one of these behaviors, such as squashing a particular feeling, so let's talk about me, for example. One of my parent messages that I was unconsciously given was, don't feel anger. And I got that from one parent, and I also got don't feel sad from the other parent. And there's a whole host of reasons why they would fear those emotions in their child from their own experiences. But growing up, it was, let's say, unsafe. Obviously, I was always safe. I had very loving parents, but it felt unsafe due to, let's say, potentially being unconsciously shamed through body language and that kind of stuff. So I learned through that not feeling anger is really important. But then as an adult, I have a defense inside me, which is to absolutely crush and squash any feelings of anger. And so a story that I often tell is, I broke up with me and my partner broke up a couple of years ago. And, I have this, what's called injunction. It's like a demand, an unconscious demand from my parents growing up, which is, don't feel. And so I was in a therapy session, and 25 minutes into talking about this breakup, the person, the therapist was like, you haven't said how you feel once. And so it's like, what is that defense? What is that adaptive behavior serving? It's like, as long as I always care for them, then I won't be abandoned. That makes sense. So that has served such a good purpose. So as an adult, then, it's about not just going, I can change, and I'm just going to push that to the side, because it's not that easy. We have to first understand it. What is the behavior achieving? And then listen to that part. So I love internal family systems, because it actually allows us to take that part of us, which for me, the part that absolutely crushes down the anger is a little knight. It was a knight. It was like a 15-year-old version of me who's dressed in like knight's gear. And that's internal family systems. We have these parts inside of us, like the inner critic or one of those. But mine was this anger pushing down knight, and he'd been fighting so hard. So I could say to that knight, what have you been doing here? And they said, I'm protecting you from feeling the anger, because do you not remember what happened when you got angry and those bad things happened? So I could say, well, thank you so much for doing that amazing job. And you've been working so hard at keeping me safe, but now it's okay. You can put down the sword. I really appreciate that you've done that. We can actually take that, allow you to relax and say, I'm an adult now. If I let some of this anger out in, let's say, assertiveness, not being bullied, choosing what I want and not fearing abandonment, I'm going to be all right, because I'm an adult. And so that is the first step of change, in my opinion, from understanding things like internal family systems, acceptance from the Eastern philosophy, all that. It's like we've got to understand why we do those things, appreciate it, thank that part that it's kept us safe, and it's literally then, as Carl Rogers says, then we can change.
Yeah, I think it's a really helpful model, and perhaps the most challenging aspects of change are letting go of things that have worked in the past, have kept us safe in the past. That's the real kind of hard bit, because it feels so very unsafe to let those go. It's not, people, there's this kind of thing about change as being kind of manifest and obvious, and actually the hard bit is the teasing apart. And for me, the other aspect is this, because there's a really strong, there's a must there. Wherever I see must, I associate musts and should, but particularly must with, or must not, with attachment, and the Buddhist idea of attachment. And this idea that that's one way of understanding that. They're obligate things. If in this situation I must, there's no choice involved. And the no choice involved is actually the problem, because it leaves no space for subtlety, and it leaves no space for anything really other than that, like that immediate, unconsidered, usually quite unskillful reaction. But actually, when we can accept it, we can introduce space to play with other alternatives. And accepting that actually when we first do it, we might be very bad at expressing these things because we haven't had a lot of practice. But over time, they can be really, really useful. And I think, the affect as information is a really, really important idea in this space. Our feelings are telling us something about the world. They might not be telling us, it might not go completely clearly from feeling to this is exactly how everything is, but they tell us something important about our needs and our state. And the more we can work with those and then express that skillfully, the better. And to go back to your example and to talk about, people pleasing and anger, is that one of the roles of anger is to identify boundary violations. It's like my needs have been violated, my needs have not been met. And that actually that's an important thing for everyone, because it happens. It's going to happen. With the best will in the world and the most careful people around you, it's still going to happen. And without being able to kind of find an expression of that, you don't have a way of dealing with that easily. You can't kind of directly deal with it, and that makes everything a bit harder. So I think that idea of kind of being able to accept what we are experiencing and then work on how to work with that instead of hoping it isn't the case, or imagining it's not the case, kind of squashing it down, not wanting to experience it, is such a powerful way of it fundamentally. In some ways, it doesn't change anything, but it opens up the possibility for a huge amount of change.
That is the thought right there. That is the thought. Absolutely love that. Yeah. And God, that is just so spot on. This isn't the change. This is opening the door to the available change. And I can actually, this is a good moment to bring it back to the title of the podcast, which is You've Changed. And again, there's this idea of when you're in a relationship, this kind of accusation, you've changed. And I think there's two things that go on when people talk about relationships. They talk about, relationships are one of the best catalysts for change because it brings up so much. This feeling of needing to feel like you belong, feeling worthy, appreciated. There's demands on you, there's responsibility. And what was that like as a child? Did you have tons of responsibility? Was everything done for you? Were you loved and appreciated? Were you not? That relationship, it literally focuses it so much. So when we think about maybe not even changing, the time that we're probably going to change the most is in that relationship. So isn't it our duty as participants in that relationship to expect the partner to change? Now, if we then expect them to change and we expect them to change in a positive way. And I think that is important. That's why person-centered therapy Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy has become so popular, because he's taken Maslow's argument of self-actualization, which is that if we take away burdens and blocks to our progression, we will actually progress in a positive way. Less harm, more care, more kindness, more happiness. And so if we can look at a relationship and think, maybe this could be a catalyst for supercharging my growth towards self-actualization. And there's a reason why therapy is effective, because you sit in one relationship where someone is unconditionally positive about you, they're non-judgmental, and they try to understand and appreciate what you're going through. And it's through that, the therapist isn't forcing you to change. They're not demanding that you go and, you know, jump off a cliff or do a bungee jump or whatever. They're not forcing you to change. They are being the space which opens the door for available change. And so that's what I'm trying to argue here, is that instead of going into a relationship and desperately trying to hold them in place, it's like, how can I be the catalyst of change for your positive growth?
Mm. And I think for me, it's, you know, any relationship, it's also, you mentioned compassion at the beginning, and compassion is such an important theme around this. It's about, I think of compassion, you know, compassion etymologically comes from shared suffering. You know, it's where does our suffering intersect? Where are we meeting in our suffering? And that being the part of the driving motivation of change. You know, it gives you an anchor. It's like we are seeking to move away from this aspect, and we move away together. And I think that actually is a really, really important thing. And actually, as part of the therapeutic relationship, that acceptance that a therapist is genuinely in there. You know, there isn't that. It's a partial detachment, but it's that, and actually that's an important thing again, and a modeling thing. You know, we don't want to be completely detached and completely kind of, you know, there's I think, you know, this idea of the kind of permanently in that meditative nirvana, like the, you know, the meditative state, but equally we don't want to be constantly right up against the thing, so we have no perspective.
Yeah.
And being able to move between those more freely is more of the practice than sticking in any one at any one point. But the therapist is kind of modeling that partial detachment, that ability to move for us. And a big part of this is actually that embodied quality. You know, how much when we're reaching out to someone and the people that we're spending time with, they're embodying on a deeper level than the words. Something about how you engage with this. And I think that's one of the things around parenting as well, and the parenting, the bits that the bits of parenting that didn't give us everything that we need and leave something for us to work with, is that wasn't embodied. It wasn't modeled for us, how you deal with this experience, this sensation. And very often that's, you know, but very often for parents, that can be really, really difficult, because they may have experienced, they may still be carrying trauma that that space isn't safe for them to engage with. So when a child triggers it for them, that's a really, really challenging thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think compassion is such a fundamental part of this. And I think it's like you can change without it, but I think that it makes it very challenging for you and quite probably painful to change without the compassion first. You're kind of dragging yourself out of that space of I need self-acceptance, or you know, I talk to myself horribly. To change that without compassion for why you do that, you're kind of having to rip yourself out of the past. And so I think that understanding that the work is understanding and compassion first, then the positive change next, makes it a much more healing experience.
I think I completely agree. And actually, for me personally, I'm not sure how true this is universally, but certainly for me personally, approaches which are led by the change first are usually actually end up being counterproductive. They usually end up building more layers and more attachment, more stuff, even though the surface is like, okay, that's better.
Yeah.
It's like, well, kind of, but also we've just, it really is burying stuff under the carpet. But it's a nicer looking carpet.
It's true, yeah. It's what we resist persists. It's that same saying, yeah, resistance breeds resistance. And if you're driving at a defense without giving it its due appreciation for the work it's done, then it's not going to be willing. You might be pretending, oh, I don't do this anymore. But unless you've done that fundamental groundwork at the base level, it's going to be quite a painful awakening when you meet someone else who, let's say, triggers that trauma response or fear response in you later on.
Particularly when there isn't a kind of an outlet for that is viable in the situation. I think that can be a very, very difficult thing. So if one of the things I like to do on this show is if you look at YouTube, there are an awful lot of people telling you things you should be doing. I like to explore things we no longer have to do. Things we might that might be there that we think we should be doing that actually not necessarily. So in this space around change, is there anything that comes up for you that that as a result of all the kind of assumptions we've been challenging this edge around change that we don't have to do anymore?
That's a really interesting question. Okay, let me go with the first thing that comes up. So for me, the first thing that's coming up right now is not believing all of the thoughts that come into our head. And I think that, again, is a huge step forward when people can embody that and actually understand that our brain creates thoughts like an organ. It is an organ, sorry. So it creates thoughts as a process of its feature as an organ, just like how the heart pumps blood around your body. And what cognitive behavioral therapy teaches us is that the vast majority of thoughts that come up are negative, because we are, still instinctively looking for the snake in the grass. We're looking for the tribe coming over the hill. So what we are, like the tribe that's coming to kill us. So we're looking for those negative thoughts. And again, this would be Sam Harris's. We won't go into it properly, but he talks about free will. And one of his core messages is that when we have these thoughts, we don't have control over them. They come into our consciousness, but our brain is serving multiple millions of functions every moment. And we have just got one of those into our brain. And so to take that as, wow, that is me in this moment, I have thought this thing, that is, it can lead to a lot of self-harm, basically, because let me tell you about this. So recently, I've been doing this challenge. It's a no complaints challenge. It's 21 days without complaining, criticizing, or gossiping. And I'm 3 months in, and the longest I've gone is 3 days. Okay, so it is really difficult because it's so inbuilt in us. And so let's take, for example, like the other day, I deleted a file on the computer, and I was sat with someone, and I turned to them, and I was just like, oh my God, I'm such an idiot. It's like, where does that thought come from? Just because I've deleted a file doesn't mean that I am this thing. And when we basically take these thoughts and we actually bring them into the real world, we actually make use of them. What this theory teaches us is that we're unconsciously telling our brain that those thoughts have a function. And so one thing that I think is really helpful for people is just to occasionally, when we have a thought which goes, I'm unloved, I'm undeserving of love. If I speak to my boss, I'm going to be abandoned. These thoughts that come up, we can actually take them and go, let's play around with that for a moment. Is that based in reality, or is that the function of my brain to warn me against asking my boss for a promotion because I fear rejection? So that is one that comes up for me as something that I don't think we need to do as much anymore.
I really like that, and that idea of a kind of partial truth. And all the best lies are partial truths. So the ones that really work, the dangerous ones. So it's really interesting that the partial truths that we're telling ourselves and what other truths are available to us, and whether they actually open up more opportunities than we might than the other ones is a really great point. I really like that. I think it was on Sam Harris' podcast that I first encountered a thought experiment around free will, because I talk to people a lot about this, and I think it's one of the very challenging ideas that comes out of this space. It's so embedded, certainly in most people's culture, this in our culture around free will, and it's actually embedded in a lot of the assumptions about, particularly the justice system. Looks very different if you engage without the assumption that there's free will. It starts to look remarkably cruel. But anyway, there's this thought experiment. Says, can you imagine a person who, with your same genetics, the same environmental experiences and everything that's happened, the same knowledge, the same everything, in the same situation as you are now, can you imagine that person ever thinking anything differently? If you can't, then where's free will? And I think that, for me, when I heard that was like, okay, yep. And I think the other thing, the difficulty, though, is when people hear you don't have free will, it gets conflated with some other things. And it's really, really important to emphasize that not having free will doesn't mean we don't have agency. Doesn't mean we don't have the ability to influence things. Doesn't mean we don't have the ability to change things. That is another, not a paradox if you sit with it long enough, but on the surface really does feel like one. And I think so that's the fear. Suddenly it feels like, well, if we don't have free will, then we must be completely passive. And that's absolutely not this, but completely the idea, and maybe this relatedly, we don't have to blame ourselves for everything that's happened up until this point.
Exactly, yeah. I think when people go, and I had this experience, which was, why am I learning and trying to understand free will and that we don't have free will? Why is the purpose? Because all it seems to be doing is kind of upsetting me and creating this feeling of unease. But I really want to understand it. Now, what I've come to understand is that appreciating that people couldn't be any other way, it reduces judgment that we have on people's actions. And so then it's also useful that we can turn it on ourselves. Time, the past, is a thought, it's a memory, it doesn't exist. And the future is an idea. So all we have is this present moment where we go, these thoughts are impacting the present moment. How can I affect change now? And even though it's not my choice, I don't get to choose the desire. This is an Alex O'Connor one, which is, you don't choose the desire to want the change. So there is no free will in that. But still, if it comes up, that's bloody great. You get to enjoy that feeling of, I want to create the change. So then you can push forward that change into the future. I think I'm hesitant to get into free will here because it's just such a deep topic, and I don't think I know. I don't think I am qualified to really discuss it properly. But let's maybe take half a step backwards. And we were talking about people identifying themselves with their thoughts. I also think there's something that people can let go of, which is just letting go of things that they identify themselves with. And this can be really helpful when you see someone who says to you constantly, like, no, I'm a failure, I'm depressed, I'm anxious. It's like, you're not the embodiment of depression. Instead, you can help change to, I have depressive symptoms. Earlier, I almost said I'm a people pleaser. And it's like, let me take the thoughts I've had and go, okay, wait, no, I have people pleasing tendencies, because it helps to reduce this, us basically deciding, okay, this is how I am. So people in their lives, what I feel happens is that we try our best not to change and hold on to these defensive patterns by putting a pole in the sand and going, I am and then whatever it is. I am a lawyer. I am sensitive. I'm a hypochondriac. And when you hold on to that, you're like desperately, don't take it off me, because it's serving a purpose. So I think that is another thing here, which I think, just to add on to that, which is another thing that people, I think, when it comes to change, look at this is the thing here. Sorry, apologies. There's a great exercise that group therapists do and people like Irvin Yalom do, which is you write down 8 things that you identify yourselves with. And I almost brought this today for us to do, but you write down 8 things you identify yourself with. And then you lay them out with the things you identify yourself most with close to you and the things kind of less far away. So let's say down here I've got DJ for me. I go like, what would that be like if I didn't like identify with the fact that I'm a DJ anymore? And you gotta feel like that. Okay, and then you keep going back, and then it's like, trainee therapist, that would be tough to let go of. I feel really good, the fact that I'm a trainee therapist. It makes me feel good. And then it's like a son, a brother, like all these ones. And when we can start to go, oh yeah, I'm also like, yeah, I would say I used to have chronic anxiety. So I'd say like I'm chronically anxious. That's what I used to say. So before, like I worked through it, and it's like, what would that be like if I just didn't hold on to that anymore? So these kind of, when you do that, again, it's another way of opening the door to change.
I really like that. And I think it's, that the meditative practice of a part of me feels this, it's not all of me, it's a part of me that is feeling this. I have a part of me is experiencing the world this way, is interpreting the world this way. And that is really powerful. And the difficulty is obviously when the more fearful anything is, or the more angry we are, or the more aroused emotionally we are in any way, the more narrow we get and the harder it is to do that. And that I think, over time, one of the things we can do is practice that. But it's in the moment, I think, when it's happened, it can be too late, and very often, and that's fine too. It's just part of learning and part of reflection. I think, again, this idea that we can go there straight away with this stuff isn't helpful, or we can just make ourselves do it through force of will, which is which loops back to the free will thing. And I'm not going to go. I think I'm going to deliberately kind of stay slightly away from that, step back from that myself. But it kind of goes there. Relatedly, and related to all of this, I think, and related to acceptance, one of my greatest challenges, and one of the challenges I come up against actually with a lot of the people that I work with as well, is because of their perspective, because of their different perspective and capabilities, they're often led to change, and to complex change, and therefore stuff that has implications for others, and to working in that space. But that's not always a space you're allowed in various ways. As a child, it can be the kind of Emperor's New Clothes thing, calling stuff out that you saw, and suddenly people are like, what did they just say? I used to have that at work and in various workplaces as well. I'd just be talking in a meeting and realize that everyone was staring at me like, I was like, okay, time to stop talking now, Matthew. But that really was me just doing my thing and creating change. So it's accepting my role in change as well as accepting my role in non-change. I think that has been a really big challenge for me. The non-changing bit is less challenging personally than accepting that I am partly an agent of change in a system, and that what the effects of that might be.
Yeah, I think it is. I'm just thinking about what you're saying, and also what you were saying before about. Yeah, let me address the thing you said just before as well at first, which was about it not being a perfect practice. And yeah, I really want to dispel any ideas. I mean, obviously, I'm so young that there's still obviously so much for me to work on. I'm so unbelievably flawed. And I think it's like, that's where meditation actually has one of its greatest strengths, is that they call it a meditation practice. It teaches you that you're going to, and I'm bracket fingers here, which is just, you're going to fail to be meditative over and over and over. Like, I've meditated for 5 years now. what have I done? Maybe 10 seconds of no thought at one point. Like it's not it's not possible. And so you get to enjoy the experience of just relentlessly interrupting yourself and going back into the practice. And so this change work of sitting in the fact that we're going to be changing and that things aren't going to be easy, that is one of the greatest strengths I think of meditation. So yeah, not looking for perfection. They talk about this. It's like, don't turn the fact that you're one of the hindrances that you're a perfectionist into this world of I'm trying to be better and then trying to be perfect at that. Be perfect is my driving behavior. That's one of my key ones. So I really struggle with that, but I think meditation has a good place there. And then the other thing you were saying about coming to that place of understanding that you can impact change in people and what is that experience like for you, I think can be quite a daunting experience.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, and I think it relates to the will thing, and the change that we can control and fully control versus the change that we affect just through being, and that latter one is definitely scarier. Certainly for me. So, but equally, it's our most powerful form of change. And being, the more we're comfortable with that, and the more we can kind of channel that and work with that, certainly my experience is I've become much more at ease with doing that. Work has become more satisfying, and I think that connects us with our really big work, whatever that is, in the longer run. Yeah,
for sure. I think there's a great explanation for happiness, which is happiness is being as close to your authentic self as possible. And so when you're talking there about sitting in the fact that you're going to change, even when you don't try to, it will just happen. When we can think, if we can really sit in the feeling of self-actualization, that when we change, if we change, it will be positive. If we can let go of the things that are in front of us, the blocks, then we're going to be happier. We're going to be less burdened. Then we can basically sit in that a little bit easier. The shoulders can drop a little bit more. And then just one last thing is to say, and this, I wish I brought this in earlier, but this is the absolute essential, in my opinion, one of the essentials when looking towards the partner. When looking towards this you've changed thing and flipping it on its head, it's going, you're going to change and I'm going to be that catalyst for you. And basically, let me get my thoughts here, because this is, I think, such an important one. The thought's gone. But yeah, basically, it is absolutely essential, when they're going to be changing. I wish I had the thought still. Don't have the thought. We're going to carry on.
Cool. No, we're kind of getting towards the end of the hour, and one of these interesting things is I find there are unconscious bits of my brain that prevent me from going down rabbit holes towards the end of the show by doing exactly what just happened to you. So I think there's, this is one of the weird things about it. It's like, oh, I want to follow that. Oh, actually, no, I don't have time. But the bit of the brain that says you don't have time doesn't necessarily make it to consciousness. It's just like, no, you're not having that after all, which can be very frustrating.
I'm sure I'll think of it literally the moment we finish. And like we mentioned before about doing the other podcast, maybe I'll bring it there.
Well, that's it, exactly, and that's exactly where I was going with this. So, as we're coming towards the end of the hour, and I think this is such a big and complex space, and it can be very, very difficult to know where to start or to continue sometimes with this work. But I know you offer some stuff, and your podcast and create content around it, which is a great way to do it. And we're planning to record a conversation and can kind of continue this conversation, take it in a slightly changed direction in the different context, and carry it on. But do you want to say a little bit more about how people could get in touch with you, find out more about your work and that kind of thing in the podcast?
Absolutely, yeah. So thank you, man. Yeah, my podcast is called Reuben Recommends. And on there, basically, I take this idea of resources like books and podcasts being such a great catalyst for change. And what we were talking about earlier is understanding yourself and doing awareness work. So becoming aware of your processes, aware of the patterns that you follow. That awareness can then lead to compassion, understanding, and then letting go of those things. And here we go. Literally in the moment, I've remembered what I was going to say, so I'll add it on in a moment. So yeah, it's basically, so on the podcast, I have challenged myself this year to, let's say, consume 60 books. And so my idea for the podcast is, what am I learning through this process of being on a counseling training and through these materials? And what can I bring to you to really make it digestible, interesting, and actually effective at creating real change in your life? So that's the idea of the podcast. And I'm absolutely buzzing to have you on for next month's episode, which will be coming out on September the 15th. And we're going to be basically taking this idea of change and working with it in a few different ways. So I'm really excited for that. And we're going to be looking at it from a bunch of new angles. So it'll be very different from this episode. And yeah, if people want to listen, it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You just type in Reuben Recommends, you'll find it there and you can dig on in. If you want to actually get in touch with me, my email is reubenwachs@gmail.com. And I'm sure you'll put my name in the podcast description. So yeah, I'm sure you'll be able to find it. And yeah, get in touch on the email. I'm also on Instagram a little bit, Reuben Wachs. But yeah, man, it's been such a pleasure. And I look forward to meeting the new audience. And thank you all for listening as well. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's I'm really looking forward to seeing where we go with this conversation further, and the opportunity to do it. One of the not quite regrets of this show, but one of those dangling possibilities that I would like to follow up is often to continue these conversations in different ways. And it's not something I always get the opportunity to do. So it's nice to have it so immediate and quick. So you can find direct links to the podcast actually in the show notes of this show as well. So if you do want to connect, then yeah, please do check it out. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today, Reuben.
And I won't be able to forget that. If I don't say the point.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Here we go. Here it is. The point, which is when you're in a relationship and people are changing and you want them to change, it's not to fulfill your needs. It's to make sure that it is to allow them to experience life with more freedom, less anxiety, less burdens. So it's not, I want you to be more funny. I want you to be like better at this. It's, how can I listen and play that role of almost like what a therapist does, which is giving you a space for telling me who you are, how you became that way, and allowing that person to change in a way that makes them happier. So it's got to be that listening, understanding, and compassion first for them, and then they can become who they really are aiming to be. What Carl Rogers would say, become themselves. And so when we want this change for our partner, we've got to check ourselves and go, do I really want that because I just want more food cooked for me or a cleaner room? Or is it because I want them to, be less burdened with this need to be perfect, to beat themselves up all the time, to make sure they're small so they don't go for bigger things? So that is the key as well. When it comes to you affecting change in others, it's for them and not us. So yeah, thank you for letting me finish that point.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you. And I think as a jumping off point for another conversation, there's some really exciting stuff in there, particularly for me around our helping, our desire to help, and where that originates from and how to express that well and skillfully. Because I think that can be a really tricky, much more tricky space than a lot of people give it credit for. So I think that would be a really, really interesting thing to get into. But yeah, thank you. And thank you all for watching and listening. Really hope this has got you thinking and got you kind of asking some questions of your own. If it has, please do reach out and ask, or anyone really, anyone else, just share it and have those conversations. The next episode, next week, I'm going to be talking to Anne Skinner about the idea of fitting in, what fitting in means. This is a really, really interesting one. Because for me, there's something valuable in not wanting to make people feel awkward, in not being the kind of, not sticking out, not being that problem, and therefore being excluded. But equally, the over-adaption has its own huge problems. And again, it's one of those things that seems on the surface positive, but overplayed can be really, perhaps more of a problem than the opposite. So that is going to be next week, and I don't have the date yet. So please do check the upcoming notes, the upcoming events. It's all out on YouTube, where you can also see the past episodes, and you can join us then. Before the show and before next week's show. And in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thanks very much, and goodbye.